I'm Maria, and this happened when I was in the ninth grade. I got home from school around 3:30 in the afternoon, knowing it'd be at least an hour before my parents got back from work. Usually, I'd spend that time watching TV or working on homework, but that day, something felt off. The moment I walked through the door, I had this unsettling feeling that someone else was in the house. It was just a sense at first, like I wasn't alone. Then, I started hearing noises from upstairs. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was probably the wind or the creaky old floorboards, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. They weren't just random sounds, they were footsteps. Someone was walking around up there. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibility. Someone had broken in. Maybe they were there to steal something, or worse. I quietly tiptoed to the base of the stairs and looked up. That's when I saw him. A man standing at the top, looking down at me. His face was lost in the shadows, but I could tell he was tall, strong, wearing a black hoodie, jeans, and light brown work boots. I froze. Even with the front door right behind me, I felt trapped. I tried to back away, but my legs were shaking so badly I stumbled. He started coming down the stairs. That's when my body finally reacted. My legs kicked into gear and I ran as fast as I could, straight out the back door, across the lawn, and to my neighbor's house. Mrs. Carter, my neighbor, was this sweet old lady who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. I banged on her door, breathless, and when she opened it, her eyes widened with shock. I quickly explained what had happened, and she immediately pulled me inside. We sat in her living room while she gave me a glass of water to calm my nerves. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, we heard a car pulling up to my house, then speeding off. The man must have left. But would he come back? I didn't know, and that thought terrified me. Mrs. Carter tried to reassure me, saying everything would be okay. She called the police and they arrived shortly after. The police searched the house, but there was no sign of him. He was long gone by then. Later, we discovered that some of my mom's jewelry and other valuables were missing. All in all, it wasn't more than $1,000 worth, but I couldn't help but think maybe I scared him off before he could take more. Unfortunately, they never caught the guy. For weeks afterward, I was terrified to be in the house, always worried he might come back. I slept with the lights on and found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, the fear faded and life went back to normal, but I never forgot that day. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run when I did. It was a close call, and I'm just glad I got out. When my parents got home, they were beyond angry, not just at Jim, but at my brother for leaving me alone in the first place. Jim never faced legal consequences, as he played it off like he had been invited, but he was banned from our house. I forgave my brother eventually, but it took time. Those two incidents, the shadow figure and Jim, left me shaken for a long time. Now, years later, I've learned to trust my instincts and never ignore when something feels off. This happened 7 years ago when I was 13. I'm 20 now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents were out of town dealing with a family emergency, leaving me alone in the house for a few days. Being an only child, I was used to it and never really got scared staying by myself. It was the third night, and I was just relaxing, playing video games, and snacking on junk food when I heard a knock on the door. Late-night visitors weren't exactly common, so I walked over to see who it was. Through one of the small glass windows next to the door, I saw a man peeking in. He was shouting that he was hurt, asking to be let in. I asked what happened, and he claimed he'd broken his foot while walking around the neighborhood. His story didn't add up. Who takes late-night walks and ends up with a broken foot? His behavior was strange too. I told him I'd call an ambulance, but then he flipped. Suddenly he was yelling threats, saying he'd slit my throat and cut my body to pieces if I didn't let him in. That's when I knew this wasn't just some accident. I ran straight to the kitchen, grabbed my dad's shotgun from the highest shelf, and called the police. I told the guy the cops were coming, but he didn't seem to care. In fact, he told me they wouldn't arrive in time. He started pounding on one of the dining room windows, and the way the glass was shaking, it looked like it wouldn't hold. Panicked, I rushed upstairs to my room and hid under the bed, clutching the shotgun. I called the police again. The operator assured me help was just minutes away, but just as she said that, I heard the window break. He was inside. I could hear him moving through the downstairs rooms, then heading up the stairs. He went into my parents' bedroom first, rifling through their closet. Then I heard him at my door. He started kicking it, and after a few hard blows, it came crashing down. I could see his feet as he entered my room. He went straight for the closet, which I had purposely locked to buy myself time. He muttered, "I know you're in here." My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I considered my options. Should I try to cut his legs or sneak past him? My mind raced, but in the panic, I forgot where I was and accidentally bumped my head against the bottom of the bed. The noise gave me away. He turned around, taunting me, saying I thought I was smart for hiding. But then, in the distance, I heard sirens. His demeanor changed instantly. He muttered something about me being lucky this time and tried to bolt. As he ran for the door, I grabbed his foot, making him crash to the ground. I held on as tightly as I could until I heard the police charging up the stairs. They took over from there, tackling him to the ground. When I stood up, shotgun still in hand, the police momentarily aimed their weapons at me. I quickly explained the situation, and they backed off. They found his van parked right outside, loaded with knives, duct tape, a camera, and rope. Chilling. I can't even begin to imagine what might have happened if I hadn't locked that closet door. The police called my parents, and they came home 3 days early. My mom wouldn't let go of me when she hugged me, and my dad was just as shaken. The man was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but it didn't change the fact that I had nightmares for months. We eventually moved out of that house, but the fear lingered for a long time. I never spent a night alone again until I moved out of my parents' place, and even now I have 3 guns at home, just in case. It took me a while to regain a sense of normalcy. That incident shaped the way I view safety. There's no going back to feeling invincible after something like that. You learn quickly that danger can show up at your door, and when it does, it's all about how prepared you are to face it. I'm 19 now, but this story took place when I was 17, during a hot August afternoon. Before I get into my experience, I want to share a few things that happened to my mom and brother in the same house. Both of them experienced sleep paralysis multiple times, something they never dealt with before we moved in. They described it as feeling like someone was pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. They would wake up unable to move or speak, filled with fear. Another strange thing that happened to them was having their blankets yanked off while they slept. My brother experienced this several times, while my mom only had it happen once. These incidents were unnerving, but none of us were prepared for what I would go through. It was a typical weekend. My mom had taken my brother to soccer practice, and I was home alone, playing video games online with a friend. After we finished gaming, I said goodbye, turned off Discord, and flopped onto my bed. I pulled up YouTube, eager to watch my favorite YouTuber's latest upload. As I lay there, I started hearing noises coming from the kitchen, like dishes rattling in the sink. That caught me off guard since I was alone in the house. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of cabinets opening and closing. I naively assumed my mom and brother had come home early, so I got up and walked down the hallway to see if they were back. But as I reached the end of the hallway, what I saw wasn't my family. Standing there, at the far end of the hall near the kitchen, was a dark, mist-like figure. It had no clear form, just a black shadow that seemed to float. I was frozen in place, completely in shock, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After what felt like forever, I finally snapped out of it, turned, and bolted back into my room. I slammed the door behind me, pressing my body against it as if that could keep whatever it was out. My phone was on the bed, so I quickly grabbed it and texted my mom, telling her what had happened. Her response was immediate. She told me to leave the house and go to a friend's place until they got back. I cautiously opened the door and peered down the hallway. Thankfully, it was clear. I grabbed my skateboard, threw on my shoes at the front door, and dashed outside. I barely kept my balance as I sped down the street toward my friend's house. When I got there, I told him everything. To my surprise, he believed me without hesitation. He even shared that he'd seen something similar when he stayed at my place once. He said he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a dark figure standing in the kitchen, staring down the hallway toward the bedrooms. He had thought it was just a dream, so he never mentioned it, until now. My name's Dennis, and I've been living in an apartment above a store for almost 5 years now. It's an old building with a lot of character, located in a lively part of the city that comes alive at night. The area is filled with bars and clubs, and on weekends, the streets are packed with people partying. I'm not much of a partier myself, but I've grown used to the noise of drunken crowds spilling into the streets, even during the week sometimes. The entrance to my building is easy to miss. There's this unmarked door tucked between two storefronts, and honestly, most people probably walk right by without even noticing it. What's worse is that the door's always unlocked, so anyone can walk right in and head up to my apartment or my neighbor's without needing a key. I share the building with just one other apartment, which belongs to a couple of college students. I rarely see them though, and that Friday night was no different. They had gone away for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. That night, I got back from hanging out with some friends around 1 a.m. I was exhausted and headed straight to bed, ready to crash. But after only a short time, I woke up to the sound of people talking in my living room. At first, I thought it was my neighbors. Maybe they'd come back early. But then I remembered they were gone for the weekend. Besides, the voices didn't sound familiar. My heart started racing as I realized strangers were in my apartment. I quietly got out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door to listen. I could hear two men talking, their voices slurred. They sounded drunk, and I knew I had to do something before things got out of hand. Gathering my courage, I took a deep breath and stepped out of my room. When I entered the living room, there were two men standing there, both looking just as shocked to see me as I was to see them. One of them was holding a beer bottle, and the other had a cigarette dangling from his fingers. They stared at me like I was the one who didn't belong there. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The men just looked at each other and laughed. They were clearly too drunk to take me seriously, and my heart pounded as I realized this could go south fast. I said, "What are you doing here?" "This is my apartment, and you need to leave," I repeated, my voice louder and more forceful. But again, they just laughed and continued talking, as if I wasn't even there. My frustration and fear were building. I knew I needed to get them out before things got worse. "Get out of here now!" I yelled, stepping closer to them. That's when things turned ugly. One of the men, the one holding the beer, pushed me hard. I stumbled back and crashed into the coffee table, knocking over a glass that shattered on the floor. That's when it hit me. These guys were unpredictable, and I had no idea what they were capable of in their drunken state. I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. Within minutes, the police arrived. I could hear them talking to the two men outside my bathroom door. A few moments later, there was a knock on the door, and one of the officers told me it was safe to come out. When I did, I saw the two men in handcuffs, being escorted out of my apartment. I was shaken but relieved it was all over. The police questioned me for a while, and I decided to press charges. They told me the men had entered through the unlocked door at the street level. That's when it hit me. I had forgotten to lock my apartment door that night. It was such a stupid mistake, and I could tell the cops were a bit annoyed with me for being so careless. I was embarrassed, to say the least. I'd been tired and had a few drinks myself, but that was no excuse for leaving the door unlocked. That night taught me a valuable lesson. I've been extra cautious about locking the door ever since. It's scary to think how easily things could have escalated, but thankfully, nothing worse happened. I was just lucky it all ended the way it did. I'm a 27-year-old woman, and I used to live in a shared house with a few of my friends from college. It had been about 5 years since we graduated, but we all found jobs in the same city, so we decided to live together. This story took place during Thanksgiving last year. My roommates had all gone to spend the holiday with their families. I, however, don't have the best relationship with my parents, so I stayed behind and had the house to myself. Besides, there was a work event that night I wanted to attend, a casual get-together at a local bar. After a couple of hours of chatting with coworkers and having a few drinks, I decided to call it an early night. I felt like relaxing at home and watching some Netflix rather than staying out late. So I ordered an Uber and waited on the sidewalk. A car pulled up, and I got in the back seat. The driver was a man around 45 years old, bald, and quite chatty. Though I wasn't in the mood for conversation, I didn't want to come off as rude, so I humored him as he asked me about my evening. When I mentioned that my roommates were away and I was home alone for the holiday, he let out an awkward laugh and said, "So you're home alone?" followed by a smile. That comment immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I regretted telling a stranger I'd be by myself, especially since he now knew my home address. But I tried to brush it off, hoping I was overreacting. When we finally got to my house, I got out of the car and headed inside, making sure to lock the front door behind me. I checked out the window and was relieved to see him drive off. Feeling slightly uneasy but trying to shake it off, I went to my room, changed into my pajamas, and settled into bed to watch something on my laptop. I was starting to relax when I suddenly heard a long, slow creaking sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone opening a door. My heart dropped. I couldn't remember if I had locked the back door. Panicking, I closed my laptop and stood frozen, listening for more sounds. At first it was quiet, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My stomach churned. Someone was definitely inside the house. I felt a wave of terror, but I knew I had to stay calm. Moving as quietly as possible, I pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door, hoping it would keep whoever was downstairs from getting in. But as I did, the footsteps grew louder and faster. They knew where I was now. I grabbed my phone, ran into my closet, and called 911. Whispering into the phone, I told the operator what was happening, and she assured me that police were on their way and would be there in 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Suddenly, there was pounding on my bedroom door. My heart raced, and I could hear the dresser starting to budge. He was trying to break in. I shouted that the police were on their way, hoping it would scare him off. Miraculously, the pounding stopped. Then I heard the sweet sound of sirens in the distance. A few moments later, there was a knock on my door, and a female officer's voice told me it was safe to come out. I opened the door, trembling. She told me that they had caught the man trying to flee and had him in custody. As I walked outside, I saw the man sitting in the back of a police car, and my heart sank. It was the Uber driver from earlier that evening. I couldn't believe it. He had waited for me to go inside and then tried to break in. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard that door creak, or if I'd fallen asleep earlier. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and it made me realize how important it is to be cautious, especially when home alone. I now make sure never to share too much information with strangers and always double-check my locks. Even though this happened a year ago, I still feel uneasy about being home alone. But I'm sharing this story because I want others to be aware of the dangers of oversharing with strangers. Stay safe and always trust your instincts. This happened almost 10 years ago. It was a weekend in September, and my parents had decided to go to a friend's dinner party, leaving me home alone in our downtown apartment. At the time, I was only 13, and since I wasn't allowed to go out alone at night, I was prepared to spend the evening inside. Being home alone wasn't a big deal to me. I was used to it for short periods, and I figured I'd pass the time doing homework and practicing piano. Around 10 p.m., while I was finishing up some schoolwork, the fire alarm went off. This wasn't entirely unusual in my building, as we'd had false alarms before. Often, people would just wait them out until the noise stopped. However, as the blaring sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent, I knew I couldn't ignore it this time. I quickly threw on some clothes, grabbed my phone, and headed for the door. The hallway outside my apartment was eerily silent. I had expected to see my neighbors rushing out, but the corridor was empty. I figured most of them had already evacuated. Though there was no smell of smoke, the flashing red lights and continuous fire alarm kept me on edge, so I hurried down the narrow staircase, illuminated by fluorescent emergency lights. When I finally made it outside, the street was crowded with people, many of them talking in hushed tones or on their phones. Fire trucks were arriving, their sirens cutting through the chaos. I felt a bit out of place and uncomfortable being there alone without my parents. Even though there were plenty of people around, I didn't know many of them well. It was a large building, and I wasn't the most social person. I found a spot away from the crowd, hoping to avoid attention, but I soon noticed an older man watching me from a few feet away. He had a scraggly beard and was wearing shabby clothes. At first, I tried to ignore him, but as I stood there, he moved closer. His breath reeked of cigarettes, and his eyes were fixated on me. He began speaking in a low, unsettling voice, making comments that put me on edge. I didn't like the way he was looking at me, and I took a few steps back, but he followed, reaching out to touch my arm. Before I could react, Mr. Allen, one of my neighbors from the third floor, appeared. Mr. Allen was a tall, burly man with a friendly face, and although we didn't know each other well, I recognized him. He immediately stepped between me and the strange man, telling him to back off. The man hesitated for a moment before slinking away into the crowd. Mr. Allen stayed with me, keeping me company and reassuring me that everything would be okay. He explained that it was probably a false alarm and we'd be allowed back inside soon. Despite his comforting words, I was still shaken. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that the encounter had left me with. After what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only about 20 minutes, the fire department gave the all clear. There had been no fire, just another false alarm. My parents came home not long after, and I was so relieved to see them. I told them about the strange man, and how Mr. Allen had stepped in to help me. It was only then that I realized how lucky I was to have a neighbor like him, someone who was there when I needed it most. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the creepy man. I never saw him again after that, so I don't think he lived in the building. He must have been some random person who saw an opportunity and took it. The experience was a stark reminder that the world can be a dangerous place, and that even in familiar settings, you have to stay vigilant. Now looking back, I realize how important it is to have good neighbors and a sense of community. In a big city, it's easy to feel isolated, but moments like these remind you that there are good people out there who are willing to help. Mr. Allen was like a guardian angel that night, and I'll never forget how he came to my rescue when I needed it most. I never imagined something like this would happen to me. You hear stories about kids left home alone when something bad happens, but I never thought I'd be one of them. I was only 13 at the time, and my parents had gone out of town to visit family. It was summer, and I didn't have school, so they left me in charge of the house. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, was away at a friend's cottage, and I was excited for the freedom of being home alone. I figured I'd spend the weekend watching TV, playing video games, and eating junk food. The first night went by without a hitch. I stayed up late, snacking and binge-watching my favorite shows. The next morning, however, I noticed something strange. All the patio furniture in our backyard had been tossed into the pool. I was shocked. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and I couldn't imagine who would do something like this. At the time, it didn't seem terrifying, more like a prank. I figured it was just some neighborhood kids messing around, although I couldn't understand why they would target us. I spent the rest of the day as usual, but boredom set in, so I started exploring the house. Eventually, I ended up in my brother's room. My brother had always been a bit of a troublemaker, and I was curious to see if I could find anything interesting, maybe cigarettes or something like that. While poking around, I discovered a false bottom in one of his dresser drawers. Hidden inside was a gun and a large sum of money. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My brother was involved in something serious, something dangerous. I continued searching and found drugs hidden in the same compartment. Suddenly, the incident with the patio furniture didn't seem so harmless anymore. Could it have been a threat? If my brother had a gun, he must have thought there was a reason to need it. I sat in his room for a long time, thinking about what to do. I could keep quiet, pretend I never found anything, or I could tell my parents. I knew telling them would get my brother into a lot of trouble. and part of me didn't want to betray him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that keeping quiet would only make things worse. My brother was in serious danger, and so was our family. I finally decided to call my mom. I explained everything I had found, and though I couldn't see her face, I could hear the disappointment and fear in her voice. She told me to stay inside and not open the door for anyone. My parents were coming home early to deal with the situation. The next few hours felt like an eternity. I sat in my room, anxious and scared, waiting for my parents to arrive. When they did, they were furious. My dad called my brother, yelling at him over the phone, and then they searched his room. They found everything I had told them about: the gun, the money, the drugs. There was no choice but to involve the police. Because my brother was under 18, he avoided a permanent criminal record, but he had to spend some time in a rehabilitation center. He was livid with me and didn't speak to me for a long time. When he finally did, he was cold and distant. I felt guilty for getting him into trouble, but deep down, I knew I had done the right thing. He had put our entire family at risk, and I couldn't let that continue. Thankfully, in the end, my brother was able to turn his life around. After spending a few months in rehab, he came back a changed person. He stayed away from drugs, focused on his studies, and over time, we were able to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, but we grew closer because of what had happened. I think he even understands now why I did what I did. It was one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make, but sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. In the end, it saved my brother, and for that, I'm grateful. This happened over 10 years ago, but I still talk about it sometimes. It's my go-to scary story for campfires. My mom started leaving me home alone when I was 12 years old. I guess that's kind of young, but I was mature for my age, and she worked a lot. Those are my excuses anyway. We had a 2-bedroom apartment in a large complex just off a major highway. I was alone one night as usual while my mom worked a late shift. I was watching TV and slowly doing some homework when, out of nowhere, I heard a loud banging noise. I couldn't tell exactly where it came from, but it sounded like a gunshot. I had never heard a gunshot up close before, so I wasn't sure. The vibrations from the noise shook my body, and it felt like I had been hit by a car. It was intense and terrifying. Without thinking, I jumped onto the floor and hid under the coffee table. My heart was pounding, and I could hear some sort of commotion outside in the hallway, but I couldn't make out what was happening. The sound of the gunshot, or whatever it was, kept echoing in my ears. I was scared beyond belief, trying to stay calm while my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was in the other room charging, and I was too terrified to move. So I just lay there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, I heard sirens. It was like a small wave of relief washed over me, but the fear was still strong. I mustered the courage to peek out the window. At first, there was just one police car, but soon more started arriving. Before long, there were at least 12 cop cars and 2 fire trucks parked outside the building. I could hear people talking outside, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I felt sick to my stomach. All I wanted in that moment was for my mom to be there. I was so scared and alone. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only minutes before the commotion started to die down. I could hear the faint sounds of police radios and officers talking to each other. I started to wonder what had really happened. Was anyone hurt? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. My mom always taught me not to open the door when I was home alone. But what if it was the police? Then I heard a voice calling from the other side, saying they were the police and asking me to open the door. Slowly, I walked over, unlocked the door, and opened it to find 2 police officers standing there. They looked serious but calm. One of them asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but by then, I was crying. He asked if my parents were home, and I told him they weren't, but I gave him my mom's phone number. The officers called her, and they stayed with me until she came home. They were very kind, trying to keep me calm as we waited. It turned out that my neighbor, someone I had barely ever seen, was a wanted criminal. He had been living in our building for a few months, and that night, his gun had accidentally gone off. The police had been called immediately, and it caused a huge response. When I found out, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that someone like that had been living right next door to me. The thought of it still gives me chills. The police told me I had been brave to stay calm while everything was happening outside, but inside, I had felt anything but calm. For the next few days, the police sealed off the neighbor's apartment. They put some kind of tape across the door, and when they finally left, the adhesive residue stayed on the doorframe. Every time I walked by that door after, I saw those marks and remembered that night.